So welcome everyone to the Women's Major Group, Women and Gender Constituency and Campaign of Campaigns joint parallel event for this year's CSW66. We are extremely excited and it's a wonderful collaboration. So we hope you enjoy our busting of the myth of false solutions today. Before we begin, please allow us to do some accessibility and logistics notes. We will have interpretation available in Spanish and French. Please make sure to select the language you would like to listen to the meeting in, as well as speak in. Even if this is English, please make sure that you select English, because we will have speakers speaking in languages other than English. So this will allow you to make sure that you can listen in English. Please do not remain in the off channel to make the work of our interpreters easier. And it is also possible to turn on closed captions for Zoom for automatically generated closed captions. Andrea Vega-Troncoso and I will be your accessibility coordinators for today. So if you run into any accessibility issues or technical problems, please write to us directly in chat and we'll be happy to support you. In this meeting, as in all our meetings, it's very important for us to cultivate a safe space. And for this reason, any discriminatory remarks, hate speech, denial of self-proclaimed identities, anti-rights discourse, and other forms of discrimination against the folks and groups speaking in these meetings will not be tolerated. If such an incident occurs, the person will be removed from the Zoom platform after one warning. Our feminism is intersectional and for the liberation of all people in all their diversity. So without further ado, please allow me to pass the floor to Patricia Boland of the Women and Gender Constituency. Dear Pat, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Shinaz. Also a warm welcome from my side. I'm Pat Boland. I'm coordinating the Women and Gender Constituency currently, and I'm very proud that we are presenting and organizing that event together with the Women's Major Group and the campaigns of campaigns today. Because we are all fighting commonly for a feminist world, for feminist climate justice, and we are all advocating on international level, but also on different levels, but in the international system for policy frameworks that reflect our demands and are creating a feminist future for all. First of all, I would like to quickly go into the agenda so that you all know what is ahead of you. And I'm really glad that we have so many great and famous speakers with us today that will debunk the myth of false solutions together with us. So after a short icebreaker, which you're all invited to join, we will go into 3 frameworks that we are introducing to you today. They are not covering all false solutions to the climate crisis around, but few and very important ones that we are advocating against at the moment. So on net zero, we have Melania and Tali further explaining what this first sight harmless concept is actually about and what we have to look out for. Then we go into the concept and narrative of nature-based solutions. For that, we have Corina de la Plaza for us and Vanun, who will explain more why nature-based solutions are not as inoffensive as they look like. And then last but not least, we have Neth and Panganga explaining further for us what is behind geoengineering and what solutions can be expected from them and what we have to look out for. After that, I'm inviting Tetet, Mishi, and Kavita to join into a discussion with us of how feminist solutions should actually look like and what kind of macro demands we need to protect us from false solutions and business as usual. And last but not least, Andrea will introduce us to a final call to action that we are not leaving that space desperate and hopeless, but that we actually know where we have to go to next. So why are we talking about false solutions today? We know that the climate crisis is increasing gender inequalities. But women, girls, non-binary, and gender-expansive people are also at the forefront of fights and struggles that are fighting against false solutions and that are actually leading radical movements that are calling for climate and feminist justice. Nevertheless, we also know that we are often silenced and the voices are shut down or violently. So we are seeing that despite the knowledge of everybody that we are in a deep crisis, there are powers that are fighting for a business as usual system. They are trying to fix a broken system with solutions that can be exacerbating the inequalities that we see today and leading not to the solutions of the climate crisis, but actually digging us deeper into them. We have also seen that the IPCC is already taking up part of those solutions into scenario calculations, because when we are not drastically reducing emissions and changing our system, the argument is that we will need those solutions to be able to survive at all. So this is also why we are looking at the radical feminist solutions we need now, after we have talked about those false solutions. So we will further explore today what is behind the concepts that are around, that are taken up extensively, not only in the UNFCCC, but also in oceans conferences, in the CBD. And we have the chance now at CSW to really focus more on gender equality and make sure that those solutions are not part of this conference and demands, but that we are actually proposing the right solutions that we can take up in other processes. So we hope that you all go out from this with a better understanding why some of those concepts are really harmful and what arguments can help you to fight against them. And of course, it's also for collective movement building, because only if we are working collectively, we can change the system. Now I've already have been talking a lot, so I would really like to actually pass over the floor to you and give you the chance to think and demand what feminist climate solutions actually mean for you. For this, we have prepared a Mentimeter. I hope that most of you are maybe on the PC and are able to change between different tools. We will also use the Menti later again, so it makes sense to start now. And I'm posting the link for you. Andrea also posted the link for you, so that you can think about what feminist solutions must look like. So you can type into the solutions, but also the characteristics that you are expecting. And I will all give you a moment to think about it and then also share with us. Please let us know through the chat in case you have any problems to access the link. But that looks already amazing. We have an intersectional, gender just, regenerative, global and radical, transformative, inclusive and liberating, from local to global, we must say. LGBTQ friendly, global South led, improving living conditions, and shifting power. And I think you can continue typing in because it's getting nicer. And I think helping us a lot later also for the global call for action. But I will just end the little word cloud with the anti-colonial feminist solutions, and would like to take that keyword and demand to our first speaker, introducing the problems or the problematics about the net zero framework. So about net zero, we will hear first Melania, who is a Zimbabwean feminist activist, a land defender, and climate justice activist. She has been at the forefront at battles against extractivism in Zimbabwe and in the Southern African region in general. And she has been involved in feminist movement building and feminist popular education. I'm very happy to welcome you, Melania, and I would like to give the floor to you to better explain to us why this inoffensive word of net zero is so problematic. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Actually, let me just start by saying that the idea around net zero is extremely dangerous because it places humanity in the hands of technologies. And we all know that part of the challenge that we are facing with, we are living the climate crisis because of the growth of those same technologies. So the challenge we're sitting with is that we are trusting the system that has caused the climate crisis to be able to address the climate crisis. And let me just start with saying that, you know, when the people, I would say that climate change is a phenomenon. I know that there are a lot of debates, but I know that this is something that was discovered by farmers. But of course, we all know that usually it's attributed to some scientists because the knowledge that farmers hold, and particularly women are holding, it is often pushed to the periphery in favor of knowledge that is Western, that is masculine. And so after that realization that, you know, we are emitting excessive greenhouse gases and we are facing a catastrophe, there was a need for people to think about what do we do? How do we solve this? And the solution, if we would ask any woman who is an indigenous woman, a peasant, working class, an activist, anyone who understands how the problem that we're facing was caused by the growth of industry, excessive profits, putting profits ahead of people, the person would say, let us abandon an economic system that is harmful to the environment. That is what would make a lot of sense. Let us move away from the use of fossil fuels. Let us move away from unsustainable consumption. But you see, the solutions that were offered were to say, we need to make sure that we remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And this is where this idea of net zero comes from. The issue was not about, let us transform our production processes so that we stop polluting. Their solution was, let us create some carbon sinks, and let us do carbon capture. Let us introduce concepts like red forests. Let us plant more trees. And this has been very prominent at COP26, that, you know, we need to plant trees and plant trees. And really, the global leaders are not talking about transforming the production processes. They would like business as usual. And therefore, their solution is, let us trade in carbon, let us burn and pay, right? Let us burn fossil fuels and we pay. Let us burn fossil fuels, and then we come up with some models, some scientific models, you know, using the models to determine that if we would produce things this way, our goods this way, this is so much that we are going to contribute into the atmosphere. And now these are the number of trees that we are going to plant. And whilst I'm talking, I just want to make it clear that all the trees in the whole world are not going to absorb all the carbon in the atmosphere. That is not going to happen. And therefore, this net zero is the biggest fraud. That when we look at all corporations, this is what they are focusing on. And this, the biggest danger for me is that it is not talking about how the challenges we are facing are because of global political systems, global global economic systems that have been producing and producing and producing. They're not talking about that. In that space, I see a threat to this space, particularly for the women who are producing food, the feminists who are challenging neoliberal capitalism. It is closing, because we are being alienated from being part of the solution. But what we all know is that there is a problem that was created by capital. There is a problem that was created by the so-called global leaders. And this needs a transformation of the production processes. And I have often had some discussions with people arguing that, oh, you talk about the alternatives. Where are the alternatives? And I'm always saying there are women who are living those alternatives. The way that women who are food producers, who are working in what we call the informal sector, and the women who are indigenous are holding this knowledge. And they are living those solutions through exchanging seeds, through having seed banks, protecting their seeds and protecting their environments. I've often said to people, you know, land defenders are actually a solution to climate change, because they are defending their lands from capital. They are defending their lands from unsustainable production. And women had been protecting our forests anyway. A lot of women in Africa, in the global north, their lives and their well-being is extremely tied to the land. Our lives are tied to the land. And therefore, when we start talking about we need to be planting more and more trees, but they were not the women that were responsible for deforestation. And women all over the world have been protecting those lands, because the way we see development, this extractive development, that the whole world is focusing on. And extractive meaning extracting minerals, extracting women's labor, extracting forests, extracting rivers is exactly what the women are against. And now let us also look at this net zero and the trees which are being offered as well. I've been to Uganda and I saw the indigenous people, the women who are friends of Zoka, which is a forest, right? Defending their forest from artificial trees, right? I'm saying artificial trees because these trees are not indigenous. They were given to them so that they can be able to plant more forests, revive their forests. And the people there don't believe that their forests need any revival. The people there, they would like their trees, they want to preserve their trees. And you know, as I was just talking to the women to say, but what is wrong with the trees? They said, the trees are not conducive for our climate because they grow so tall and their roots go so deep. They take all the nutrients in the soil so that all the other plants are dying, right? All the other plants would die and that one tree species would survive. And the people are not comfortable with destroying their indigenous nature, like their indigenous forests. People who who have a relationship with the land, with the forest, they know that they need to have agroforestry. They know that a number of tree species need to live together. Just like as feminists, we believe that people in their diversities, we need to live together. That is the concept that a lot of the indigenous people believe in. But then we see the system bringing in new tree varieties into our indigenous forests. We see them keeping forests under the REDD+ projects, denying people of their forest resources so that they can keep on polluting and so that they can tell us that we are working towards net zero. And this is something that I always say, this needs to be resisted in its entirety. The early maturing seed varieties, which are artificial, because where we are heading to, the moment that we lose our local seed varieties, the moment that we destroy our subsistence economies, we are going to depend on neoliberal capitalist system. And we are going to be so dependent on it such that we are going to go back to the system where people will be scavenging for food from one factory to the other and moving from owning our own and having control of our food systems to where we need to be buying everything and where we need to depend on the market. And this is a situation that we're moving towards, which is a very dangerous situation. I know that there are some other presenters who are going to talk about geoengineering and other false solutions. I'm going to end it for now, but there is a whole system that is pushing all solutions which are not even proven. Net zero has not been proven to stop climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Melania, for this comprehensive overview. I won't attempt to mention all or summarize all points that you have brought up, but I think what has become very clear is that net zero is actually used, and we might not allow for greenwashing actually a business as usual of those that are actually causing climate change and are responsible for the emissions, also historic emissions caused in the system. So many thanks. And I think you already gave a perfect transition to our next topic. That is one of the solutions that is actually then underlying the net zero concepts. And this is called the nature-based solutions. As said, also first sight, it looks inoffensive. And Coraina de la Plaza from the Global Forest Coalition will help us to better understand how we can actually demystify that concept and why we and other feminist activists tend to actually rather refer to ecosystem-based approaches. Welcome, Coraina. She's the campaign coordinator of the Global Forest Coalition, and we will have some global perspective, including from the recently closed UNEA meeting, what we must learn about nature-based solutions. The floor is yours, Coraina.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Patricia. Hi, everyone. Yes, it's just been said that my name is Coraina. I'm with the Global Forest Coalition based in Spain, and I'm really excited to be part of this event and contribute to the discussion and demystification of false solutions. So an important part of the work we do is focus on the drivers of deforestation and therefore on of climate change too. And this includes tackling and advocating against the identified false solutions and analyzing from a feminist perspective climate and forest related policies. And in some, certain policy making spaces, and also how these policies and spaces, how they many times enable, support, and in fact promote false solutions that go against the very same crisis that they are in principle trying to address. And in this sense, one of the concepts that have gained a lot of momentum throughout the last few years and that shelters a lot of false solutions is the term nature-based solutions, or NBS. And this is nature-based solutions is a concept that was introduced in the early 2000s as an umbrella concept for ecosystem-based approaches, but also to mitigate climate change and biodiversity loss. But because this concept, NBS, broadened the scope and it was very ill-defined, it was very vague, it opened a very dangerous window that many actors, both from the public and also private sphere, are taking advantage of this window and of the ambiguity around the term to brand highly questionable practices as green, and also to rebrand old false solutions such as land-based offsets and plantations and so on, with a more how to put it, a more fashionable, a more catchy name. So yeah, in summary, NBS, nature-based solutions, is being used as a catch-all kind of term. And this ambiguity means that it can include everything, meaning it can include the good, the bad, and the evil. And at the international level, I think there has been a few key moments where throughout, mainly during the last few years, where NBS have gained a lot of momentum. One was when the International Union for Conservation of Nature, that is IUCN, put forward a definition of nature-based solutions in 2016. However, this definition, which has been one of the most often used definitions, for instance, didn't explicitly exclude false solutions like land-based offsets, carbon markets, and plantations, and so on. And it wasn't also an official agreed definitions by parties. Other two key moments for NBS where it has gained a lot of popularity was in the 2019 Climate Action Summit, and also in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change talks last year on the UNFCCC negotiations last year in Glasgow, where it was a floodgate of NBS commitments, pledges, but also net zero. We've actually seen many attempts to introduce language on MBS at international climate and biodiversity policy making, including in the UNFCCC, but also in the, for instance, in the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD. However, it was difficult to keep that MBS, luckily. It was difficult to keep that language there because, as I said before, there wasn't an official agreed definition by parties. Unfortunately, this has very recently changed because European Union sponsored resolution on MBS was very recently approved at the UN Environmental Assembly at UNEA that took place just a few days ago in Nairobi. And this means that we now have this official definition that has been agreed by parties, by governments, and that could potentially and very likely be mirrored or used in other processes like UNFCCC or the CBD. And as I said, this was very recently approved, and we still need to do further analysis and see how this evolved, but unfortunately this resolution keeps some of the main concerns and problems around MBS. Like it is doubtful, for instance, whether carbon offsets and biodiversity offsets are still part of it. And there is also in the resolution, it asks for a significant enhancement support for MBS, which opens, of course, the doors for a lot of more of MBS investments in things like monoculture tree plantations, RED projects, and other fall solutions. And in fact, another issue that I like to touch upon is that one of the most popular activities, but also dangerous proposal that we can find under the nature-based solutions umbrella, and also part of the strategies to achieve net zero commitments is, and this was mentioned by the previous speaker, is tree planting. And while, you know, for instance, gender responsive and community governed tree planting initiatives of local tree species can be really beneficial and be very good for communities and climate, what we are talking about in most cases when I say tree planting is monoculture and commercial tree plantations, which are mainly based on alien and invasive species. And these initiatives are in most cases, or many cases, handled by corporations and government with very little community engagement. And yeah, so in fact, plantations are one of the most common and commercially attractive nature-based solutions that are being proposed nowadays. But monoculture tree plantations don't bring any of the benefits that forests bring. And in fact, in most cases, they lead to land grabbing, to displacement and eviction of communities from their lands. They lead to human rights violations, to freshwater scarcity, biodiversity loss, and many other negative impacts, including gender differentiated impacts, are associated to this type of plantations. They also can only store a fraction of the carbon that forests can store. And yeah, there are emissions that derive from the land clearance that take place to establish this kind of plantations. So I say this is I think this type of projects give a very good overview, or they are a very good example of the dangers and the false solutions that are centered under, as I said before, the nature-based solutions umbrella. And just to give, because I think my time is up, a very concrete example of how all of this come together is, for instance, the example of Shell, one of the main oil companies worldwide, which has committed to get net zero by 2050, and as part of the plan to achieve this net zero, this carbon neutrality, is by promoting nature-based solutions, including tree planting. Shell has committed to invest over 300 millions of dollars in tree planting projects to greenwash and to offset their emissions instead of committing to reduce emissions. And again, this has been branded as a nature-based solution. So yeah, I think I've run out of time. I leave it at that. Thanks.
Many thanks, Corinna. In particular for your last example that is actually rounding or connecting again to the last topic of net zero and how both concepts actually are intertwined, and also to really explicitly explain why nature-based solutions can have it all. They can be good, bad, and also really the evil. So yeah, I'm really concerned to hear about the UNEA resolution, and I think it's really informative for everybody to look into that and see how we can improve argumentations to make sure that this is not taken over everywhere, in particular if we are still having the concerning parts in it that we are arguing or advocating against already for a couple of times. Many, many thanks. And now I would like to hand over to Vanun, who is the Executive Director of Climatewatch Thailand and also a PWLD member. And we will hear a little bit more about what the concept of nature-based solutions means on the ground. Vanun, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Pat. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm going to be unpacking the nature-based solutions from our discussion and our work with the women in the community. I'll starting with the concept. I've been working on energy issue, and we are, of course, against the fossil fuels. When very first time I was talking to the community members, I was talking about natural gas. See, the word natural gas is already misleading. It's from nature, it's natural. So whatever you're talking about nature or natural, it's always good. So despite the fact that natural gas is also fossil fuels, which is bad. And now I'm starting to talk with the communities about nature-based solutions, which is about nature. And to the community members, they were saying this is very misleading, because communities are already doing and practicing something which is aligned and also consistent with the nature. So when you're talking about nature-based, it's always like along with the nature. So I think the whole concept, when it is dealing with carbon trading, and when it is in the hand of big corporations, and sometimes in the hand of the government, it is really dangerous. That's how it gets into a dangerous concept of the nature-based solutions. And when we unpack this, we have to also look at what the government, like for example, in my country, is doing. They're using nature-based solutions as part or as a tool to remove communities out of the forest, because they want to conserve the forest to sequester carbon. Whether they would like to sell it as the credit for Thailand, that is another thing. And also we see that it is a tool for the private sectors, especially in big corporations having their business on fossil fuels, like coal and natural gas. I'm using the word fossil gas. It's being used by those who've been trying to find solutions for their emissions. And I think from the community perspective, it's more on why for communities themselves, they are using and they are living and having their life and livelihood aligned with the nature. So that's for them, it's quite really a challenge in understanding and trying to unpack it. But when we link it to who's using these nature-based solutions, that's really clear in terms of this concept has been implemented and also is promoted by big corporations as a way out to continue their business as usual. We have seen a number of companies and big corporations in Thailand who are really welcoming the nature-based solution as part of their strategy to become net zero or become carbon neutral. And we have also seen the list of the companies are growing. And what Thailand is doing now is creating a voluntary carbon market. And when it's launched, a number of companies are welcoming that and trying to get into this voluntary carbon market. And the strategy is, one of the strategies is to do the nature-based solutions. And that means growing trees and also and trying to be verified the amount of carbon sequestered in that plantation. And what has been going is the verification process is very stringent, even though it is a voluntary. So what it means is communities in that particular forest area are going to be removed out of the forest because that forest needs to be a place to store carbon. Any disturbance to the carbon to be leaked, that would cause the undelivery of the amount of carbon. So that would also limit the use of the communities in order to access and to use the forest, and also to go and get some kind of non-timber products in the forest as well. So we have seen that a lot of challenges and also limitations that would be happening to communities, and especially women on the ground who've been living their life and making their life out of the forest. Like forest for them is a supermarket. So they go and get food. So the limitation for them to access the food in the forest would also limit and also violate their right to food and to adjust themselves to the changing climate. So this is a very dangerous concept. And also we have seen a number of companies who are already doing it. And we still, a number of communities are also fighting for it. But of course, I mean, in terms of when it gets into the market and get the money, so that has already created some of the conflict between communities as well. So yeah, it's more on unpacking this to the community themselves, and also to look into who's really benefiting on that and who's getting away from the emissions. So and the whole thing is not really the real solution to the climate impact. I would leave it like that, Pat.
Thanks so much, Vanun. I think that gave us a sad but really key example how on a national basis or in a country like in Thailand, but also in many other countries around the world, actually multilateral companies, major emitters are really using this concept and intertwine it with other concepts like carbon markets to offset actually their fossil fuel caused emissions, and then by that affecting indigenous peoples or local communities who are actually not able anymore to secure their food sovereignty and are not able to access their land and forests anymore. So I think this gives really a clear picture how the concepts can be used in a very, very perverse way, and show us why we have to advocate against them much more. Many, many thanks, Vanun. And this is already transferring us also to the last concept that we would like to introduce, and all of you have probably already heard about, which is geoengineering. It actually summarizes different technologies underneath, and we have now Neth Danyu, who will explain us more what we can understand under geoengineering, what technologies belong to it, and what we have to expect in the future. Neth is the Asia Director and Coordinator of the Action Group on Erosion, Technology and Concentration, also known as the ETC Group, and is based in South Philippines. I'm very happy to have you here, Neth, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pat. Thank you very much, colleagues, for inviting ETC Group, etc. Group to speak in this parallel event. I'm actually sharing this slot on geoengineering with a colleague from the Indigenous Environment Network, Panganga, who will be speaking from the perspectives of grassroots, particularly indigenous communities, and how they have been actively opposing geoengineering on the ground. My task is to refresh your memories about geoengineering, or to introduce it to you if you haven't heard about it, and also to walk you through some of the technologies and the issues and where we are in terms of global governance on geoengineering. As mentioned by Pat, the concept has become increasingly more not popular. It's actually notorious than popular, um, but more known than it was 10 years ago. Actually, etc. Group started our task of increasing or raising awareness on geoengineering and its adverse consequences to the planet and people 12 years ago, no, more than 12 years ago. And we actually started a campaign called Hands Off Mother Earth, which is very much alive. I think Panganga will mention that to you. But when we started the campaign, education campaign on geoengineering and really raising critical awareness on this, nobody knew what it was. And people thought it was sci-fi. Definitely, it's not sci-fi anymore. There's a number of real-world experiments happening in different scales, and also very controversial proposals that have gained more attention and media imagination over the past few years. And geoengineering, just to review, is actually a set of technologies or a suite of technologies that are intended to intentionally intervene in and alter Earth systems on a mega scale, large scale, particularly to manipulate the climate, to counteract some of the effects of climate change in particular. Like it's been referred to as climate geoengineering in the context of the Convention on Biodiversity, where there are two soft moratorium that has been running since 2008. It's also referred to in some discussions in the UN Environment Assembly, for example, not this one, but the previous one. There was a resolution filed by the Swiss government to govern geoengineering. And there are discussions on the sides of the UNFCCC about geoengineering, but not in the formal way. There are many different concepts where where geoengineering has been lurking behind. You probably heard about carbon capture and storage, or carbon dioxide removal, or solar engineering, or maybe even this new concept called climate altering technologies and measures, or CAT-M. So that the terms are actually evolving over the years, and there's also the IPCC, in particular, since IPCC AR4 has been tackling geoengineering in different ways, all very critical, by the way, on all very, very cautious. And it's also in the IPCC, the special report on 1.5C that came out a couple years ago, that geoengineering was actually split into two terms that they said are far more concrete. One is carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, and the other is solar radiation management. And there are even attempts to just apply the term geoengineering on solar radiation management. There are officially three sets or three categories of geoengineering. As I mentioned, carbon dioxide removal, which are actually the technologies that remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere after they have been emitted. Now, I mentioned carbon capture and storage, also direct air capture, like all these artificial trees, like our colleague earlier was talking about artificial trees, engineered trees, but there are really artificial trees that are being developed to capture carbon from the atmosphere. They call that direct air capture. They are in no way looking like trees. They're very ugly. They're like huge air conditioning unit that are aimed to suck carbon from the atmosphere, process that, and split that into different substances, and keep the carbon part underground. And all of these are actually experimental, not proven, also untested, and definitely poses a lot of dangers, perhaps much more dangerous than the problem that they're trying to solve. And the second category of geoengineering technologies are called solar radiation management, or SRM. And the idea is to reflect sunlight back into space to reduce warming effect. And it's like if you will picture it in your mind, it's like actually creating or making a huge umbrella to cover the earth from the heat of the sun, to reflect the sun, to reduce global warming. So, and there's also another category, weather modification, which is far more widely used, particularly in smaller and regional scale in many countries, but still under the category of geoengineering. And all of these technologies I mentioned are actually untested, very unreliable, and poses a lot of dangers to the planet and people. And all of them are technological by nature. They are technofixes. Talk about false solutions. Geoengineering is actually the embodiment of false solutions. Also, I have to mention that much of the vaunted claims on the benefits of geoengineering in recent years are actually attached to that concept of net zero that our colleagues were mentioning earlier, that in order to bring down to net zero the carbon emission, greenhouse gas emission, you need carbon dioxide removal technology. So more and more, particularly CDR, have become part of that, all that promotion of net zero technologies. In fact, they call carbon dioxide removal technologies as nets, no, net emission technologies, net zero technologies. And as I mentioned earlier, there are some ongoing real life or real world outdoor experiments on geoengineering, particularly on carbon dioxide removal. Over the years, there's been dozens of experiments around ocean fertilization, which is a technology under that category, carbon dioxide removal. And the idea of ocean fertilization, you may think it is stupid, but there's been actually tons of money that has been spent on this. The idea of dumping iron particles or nitrogen on parts of the ocean or the seas, to be able to fertilize it and promote the growth of phytoplankton. And phytoplankton are of course known to have the capacity to suck carbon from the atmosphere. And the idea, if you have megatons of carbon of phytoplankton sucking carbon from the atmosphere, they will be able to bury carbon in the seabed. But of course, that's conceptually happening. But all the other experiments that have been done so far have failed and showed that thanks to the food chain, not all of the carbon that phytoplankton suck actually are buried in the seabed, but actually escape back into the atmosphere. So there's been a lot of scientific studies that actually debunk the entire idea of ocean fertilization, and yet millions of dollars continue to flow into new experiments, into new harebrained ideas on how to do ocean fertilization more effectively, and therefore posing so much harm on ocean biodiversity, on marine biodiversity, and also to the livelihood of fisher folks, of communities that are reliant on the ocean, on marine environment. So you have all these crazy ideas that are techno fixes that are being actually experimented largely by institutions in the north, in developed countries, and run mostly by, surprise, surprise, men, white men. And it's not just from me, but actually many literature actually take note of this, that most of the geoengineering technologies are actually ideas that are developed and are being invested on, but in terms of time and money, by men, and also funded by, some of them are actually funded by philanthropic organizations such as Gates, for example. So just to also go through the issues on why are we, not just because it's just it's a false solution, not just because it's so north dominated, but because of the key principles that none of these geoengineering techniques actually aim to address the root causes of climate change. As mentioned by previous colleagues who spoke, none of these false solutions actually address the root causes. They may partially counteract some of the symptoms, but none of them address the fundamental issues about fossil fuel production, about massive industrial production and unsustainable consumption patterns, deforestation. None of them address unsustainable agriculture and food systems and uncontrolled urbanizations. All of these drivers of climate change will continue, regardless of the millions that they have been investing on geoengineering technologies. Also, there are computer simulations and studies that have been done across many institutions in the North that actually show the potential impacts and unintended consequences on ecosystems and ecological balance of many of these technologies. I mentioned ocean fertilization, and then I mentioned solar radiation management, which actually brings in adverse consequences as a result of termination shock. Just to mention that solar radiation management was actually inspired by a natural consequence, a natural phenomenon, sorry, namely volcanic eruptions. So they have observed over the years, particularly when Mount Pinatubo here in the Philippines erupted in 1991, that volcanic eruptions can actually cause cooling globally. When Mount Pinatubo erupted in 1991, climatologists observed that the global temperature actually cooled down by 0.5 degrees over 2 years. So they said that if we can simulate the eruption of volcanoes as massive as Mount Pinatubo, then we can buy time and cool the planet. So they are in these harebrained ideas of how do you mimic the eruption of volcanoes. So there are proposals to fly thousands of high-flying planes to bombard sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere. There's an ongoing study spearheaded by Harvard University to create this stratospheric balloon that also will bombard particles into the stratosphere to create that umbrella or that blanket that will shroud the Earth in the stratosphere to cool down the planet. And they say if you do this every 2 years, you will not have termination shock. And termination shock is actually what our nightmares are made of. No, it has actually adverse consequences on the planet. It could actually change hydrological patterns. It could actually create massive drought in areas beyond our imagination. So they said to avoid that, you actually do solar radiation management every 2 years. And they said it will be cheap, quote unquote. Cheap is, by the way, tens of billions of dollars. So these are the kind of mentality that are behind geoengineering. Definitely, there will be unequal or uneven impacts across regions and areas. In order to have an impact, of course, it has to be inherently transboundary and large scale by nature, and which means that decisions on research and development and deployment are inevitably becoming top-down. It's actually just in the hands of the few and pretty centralized. And this is the reason why there are governments such as Switzerland that are actually interested to bring this whole discussion on the global scale by bringing this to the UN. But of course, there are conflicting interests around this. So we really have to be involved in that discussion at the UN as civil society. And lastly, just before I pass this on to Panganga, I know I've actually overshot my time, just to inform everyone that while there is no clear place in the UN where geoengineering is being discussed or governed, there are actually a number of existing moratoria that applies to different technologies in geoengineering, namely ocean fertilization. There is an outstanding moratoria that was adopted in 2008 in the Convention on Biodiversity, which rolled in to the London Convention and London Protocol that adopted the decision in 2013 to prohibit all ocean fertilization activities except legitimate scientific research. Also in 2010, the CBD adopted soft moratoria on all geoengineering techniques, except CCS from fossil fuels, with some very tight limitations and exemptions. So we have been calling for a ban on geoengineering because these technologies are inherently high risk, inherently unfair, and inherently false. So I end my presentation there. Sorry for overshooting my time.
Thank you, Neth. And I know it's basically impossible to cover all aspects of geoengineering within like 7 to 8 minutes. So many thanks for this very clear categorization, explanation of different techno fixes, and also on touching upon actually everything behind those fixes, because they are unbelievably expensive. This is where money comes in. We know that money and funding is lacking on much more important issues that are actually contributing to a feminist, caring and just world. So I think it's really important to look also at that aspect. And it's really in the hands of governments and mainly scientific discourse. So this is why I'm extremely proud and happy that we have Banganga with us, who is actually a climate geoengineering organizer and is also an indigenous mother from Sivongak. I'm sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, please correct me. And this is located in the so-called Bering Strait. So I'm very happy to give you the floor. Please take your 8 minutes, because I said we have far too little activists against geoengineering solutions, and I'm really glad to hear about your struggles. The floor is yours.
Hold on a second, I'm trying to see. Can you all hear me? Yeah.
Perfectly.
Okay, great. So wanga pangangan ng nakapangawi wanga ataka agunaterma Kirsten Nugak Pass wanga sivunga kami and my Ramka is the Kiwagami. I come from an island between Alaska and Russia, what is called Alaska and what is called Russia. And in the 1800s, in the name of capitalism, the whale population that my island relied on was decimated. And during the Cold War era, there was a military base built on our island. And when it was time for that base to come down, the troops were told to cut the lines, take a backpack and leave. And in doing so, the fuel from their base and all of the chemicals from their base spilled out into a lagoon that we relied on to subsist. Our children learned how to swim in that lagoon. And this resulted in many health issues, including high rates of cancer. So anybody who was living at that part of the island, if they interacted with that lagoon at all, it's not a question of if you get cancer, it's when. And in Alaska, in our region, when we've spoken about history, elders have shared with us that there were also experiments with radioactive iodine, where people were injected with radioactive iodine to see if our bodies would survive more in the cold, and for other reasons. And so the notion of our bodies being used as sacrifice zones to see if technologies are safe for white bodies and for white people. The notion that our lands are sacrifice zones for the pursuit of capitalism and colonialism, it's not a new concept. And this concept of geoengineering is woven into that same theme. And so this includes all the geoengineering that Neth had mentioned, including CCS, carbon dioxide removal, and solar radiation management, and those are the ones that I'm going to focus on. We all know that indigenous communities are least responsible for global emissions and were the first to experience the impacts of global warming. Those who are responsible for expediting our extinction meet and agree on very reckless policies that use language such as net zero emissions and nature-based solutions. We recognize that these are cheat codes that really mean business as usual. A cap and trade carbon market that allows for offsets also equates to greenwash disaster capitalism, such as dangerous theoretical geoengineering techno fixes that are generally tested on indigenous lands. All of this is done without free, prior, and informed consent. So under the umbrella of solar radiation management, we include a technology created by a person called Leslie Fields, and that project is now called the Arctic Ice Project. It's being tested in Utqiagvik, which is near my homelands in the Arctic, among other places. This project proposes to dump hundreds of tons of synthetic silica hollow glass microspheres across locations that include the Beaufort Gyre, the Fram Strait, and the Himalayas. Currently, this so-called technology is being tested on ocean ice on a lake in Utqiagvik, and it's being done with no tribal government consultation, no environmental impact statement. And the supposed idea is that the material will increase ice surface albedo and give the ice a chance to thicken, quote unquote, buying time to combat climate change. Arctic Ice Project technology is unproven and it diverts funding and attention away from solutions that we know will work, like keeping fossil fuels in the ground. Indirectly, this prolongs human rights violations such as resource extraction and toxic exposure to people from indigenous lands. The experiments do not appear to take into consideration real-life environmental factors such as snow covering the beads or the Arctic's tropical storm-forced winds carrying them into unintended areas. There's been no formal and publicized consultation with tribal government or nonprofit tribal governing bodies. There has been no consultation with indigenous rights groups who are organized around the Marine Mammal Protection Act, such as the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission and the Eskimo Walrus Commission. There have been tribal organizations in Alaska who have raised concerns, and the Arctic Ice Project is not being transparent about opposition or concerns that have been raised. Tribal members across the coasts of the Arctic who rely on Arctic ice are not fully informed about the project, including its scope or the intention behind it. They have not been included in discussions on a broad scale, and there has been no formal consent of all indigenous nations who live where this is being tested and where this is intended to be used. This also includes Harvard University's ScopeX project, which Nef touched on earlier, who are conducting research on a technology that would release particles such as sulfur dioxide into the air to dim out the sun, quote unquote. The Sami Council was informed after several unsuccessful plans to conduct field tests over US territory, US indigenous territory. The ScopeX research team moved their first part of the experiment to Sami territory. Apart from possible negative consequences of the technology itself, the indigenous peoples in the United States underlined that the testing would violate the sacred relationship between Mother Earth and Father Sky, and they effectively stopped the experiment from proceeding in the United States. The planned experiment would be used to see the effects of different aerosols. This would be to later advance modeling of stratospheric aerosol injection, a technique in which aerosols of diverse substances would be released about 20 kilometers above the Earth's surface, while the testing itself would be small and potentially have, quote unquote, no or minor impacts, or so they claim. The Sami Council view these tests as a first step toward legitimizing the stratospheric aerosol injection. technology to be further developed. So this also includes dangerous and unproven technologies under the umbrella of carbon dioxide removal, carbon and capture, a lot of which is used for enhanced oil recovery. It's unsafe, ineffective technology with billions to support it and billions more to be gained. These technologies result in carbon credits or carbon equivalent credits, which are then turned around and sold to large polluters, such as fossil fuel companies. And this includes planting trees. Planting trees can result in carbon credits. Up north in Utqiagvik, their health, hunting, fishing, food gathering locations have been harmed already from fossil fuel industries, where the Arctic Ice Project is doing the pilot study with no free, prior, and informed consent. They operate out of a naval-based research site through contract with a for-profit native corporation, which is not the same as consultation with a tribal government. Indigenous peoples have served as the testing grounds for new technology. They did it when testing nuclear technology in the Marshall Islands. They did it when they injected Alaska Native peoples with radioactive iodine. And now these techno fixes. None of these mechanisms have firm law governing their use. Some of these technologies may deceptively appear less lethal than others. Even if this were true, we must keep in mind that once a technology is approved and there is a governance framework in place, it sets a dangerous precedent for others as well. I'm going to wrap up here pretty soon. So there's a direct connection between colonization, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, militarism, and extractive resource industry, including geoengineering experiments, which are part of the same destructive machine. The rape, exploitation, and destruction of our land is reflected in the rape, exploitation, and destruction of our femme and non-binary relatives. It means we are on the front line of the fight just by our mere existence. And the importance of our voice is obvious by how much effort is placed by those systems in silencing us. When we see the impacts of climate change, our knowledge and expertise is kept out in the spirit of oppression, extractive industry, and colonialism. We must demand enforced policies that require free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. If we had ensured this globally from the beginning, harmful technologies such as fossil fuels and geoengineering would not be placing us in the danger that they're placing us in for mass extinction. Thanks.
Many thanks, Panganga. And I hope that we hear more from you in our call for action on how to support each other and really make sure that these harmful technologies are not further continuing and writing history. And I think this was really enlightening, in particular for me, to put the geoengineering tests actually in a historic continuity of testing technologies on Indigenous peoples' land, and also to understand that Indigenous peoples' rights are hurt and violated. Their lands are grabbed, but also, or your lands are grabbed, but also that your bodies are used for experiments. So I think this is really important to understand, in particular, looking at the fact that Indigenous communities have really not contributed to the climate crisis that we've seen today, but rather offer solutions for us. So many, many thanks. And I'm also glad that you all had a little bit more time to give your inputs and explain more, because unfortunately, Tylee Terena has not been able to join us due to connectivity issues. Tylee Terena is from the Terena Nations and Indigenous Agricultural Community in Brazil. So I'm really glad that we could hear from you as the last speaker now. And I will share, or we will share, Tylee's presentation afterwards with all of you, that you can still hear or read what she would have said. So very sad about that. But also now we would like to give you a little break to lean back and digest what you have just heard before we go into our discussion round. So I would like to hand over to Shehnaz now to start with an inspiring movie, and I hope you enjoy.
Thank you so much, Pat, and many thanks to all our speakers for these really sharp and strong responses that have been very informative for all of us. So now we're going to show you about health of an incredible advocacy video from Campaign of Campaigns on the false solutions. And then later on, we will share the link in the chat as well if you want to amplify it and also watch the full version. Sorry, I will need to share again because I forgot to share the sound. Apologies, coming back to just now. Here we are.
And the Net Zero Emissions Campaign! It will stop climate change! Everything has been scientifically calculated to mitigate emissions. Here is our formula. Suppose our emissions are 100 million tons of CO2. In that case, we just need to get a forest with, let's say, 100 trees. So we solve the equation. If the forest absorbs the carbon dioxide emissions, 100 minus 100, we have 0 as a result! The best thing is that we already have plenty of trees! Yes! We just need to preserve them and prevent illegal logging. You might be asking yourselves, how do you protect the forest? Get into the carbon market! If you are a wealthy nation generating enormous amounts of CO2 emissions, buy carbon certificates! You will be able to keep your emissions without affecting the corporations in your territory. And you will receive a nice green certification. Everything sponsored by the taxpayers!
Stop! It's a trap! What you have to do is to cut your CO2 emissions.
Look, the forests that already exist cannot cancel the CO2 emission generated by those multinational corporations.
So they're actually proposing to continue with the fossil fuels extraction while making us believe that forests alone can cope with the burden of eliminating all that CO2. The truth is, emissions continue to increase, worsening the global warming.
I'm still not done. Why are you mad? Do you want to go greener? We will do it! We have other solutions! Nature-based solutions. We will grow soy, and we will have biofuels.
Stop! Do not destroy our forest!
As I was saying, this is how we stop climate change! And we create jobs!
This only makes the wealthy wealthier. It destroys the ecosystems, displacing and threatening the lives of animals and people.
Oh, there's no pleasing you. But you won't be able to resist this other solution. It is like going on a hunting trip. It is geoengineering. We shot at the clouds to dissolve them. So we can manage the weather at our convenience. Isn't it wonderful?
That's despicable!
While the governments continue with their false solutions, the planet is still suffering. The greedy sector wants to blame the people. But the greedy sector, the wealthy nations, and the financial institutions under their control are the true responsibles. They have been destroying the planet for centuries. Destruction continues. The greedy sector gets no satisfaction.
Help!
We can't go on! They have only one option left. To pressure global decision makers to demand justice.
You have a historical responsibility!
You and your people are also responsible for climate change. We are all responsible.
We are all responsible. We are all responsible.
Really? Seriously?
Increase the power.
What do we want?
Climate justice!
When do we want it?
Climate justice!
Thank you, Chinas. I hope you are all still with us or able to get back now to the next discussion round where we just connect to the video. Now we demand climate justice and will further discuss on how feminist solutions look like against the climate crisis. I'm giving the floor in a second to my colleagues Kavita, Tetet, and Mishi, who just will have the time to introduce themselves quickly once they start speaking, because we have a little overrun of time. So it would be great to have the discussion where you can also raise your hands in about 25 minutes and then have or 20 minutes and then have a wrap up in 5 minutes, and our call for action also in 5 minutes. I hope that is fine, Kavita. I think you can do anything happen, and I give the floor to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kavita. I'm part of the Women in Gender Constituency, and I'm here with my good friends and colleagues, Tetet and Mishi. So Tetet, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm trying to keep the energy up at 11:30 p.m. in Manila. And I'm sure it's what, 2 a.m. in Sydney?
It's 2:30 a.m. for me. So
oh, wow.
Wish me luck.
Definitely. We have a lot of great inputs, and I'm really, really looking forward to having this conversation with everyone. Hi, Mishi.
Hi. Are you all good? And sorry for staying a bit late.
All good, Mishi. All good. Mishi is also joining us from Geneva. So as you know, this is mostly a global space. So thank you to all of you who are doing very late hours or very early morning hours. we thought, because we've just heard so much from such a great lineup of speakers, whether there were any questions, any burning questions. We don't have a lot of time, but it would be good if we could just interact a bit with the participants. And if any of you had any questions that we could perhaps elaborate more on. Anybody? Or if you just want to throw it in the chat. No?
People are overwhelmed by so many of those false solutions. But maybe, Cav, you know, we've seen the video and I recognize my voice in that video. But maybe you can, you know, you can try to bring us back again. Why do we say these are false solutions before we start moving into what are the real feminist solutions? Why do we say it's false? What's wrong with them?
Okay, so, you know, I've been reading this book, right? And I'm going to share it with all of you because I think it's super interesting. It's called, oh, my screen's blurred, sorry. So it's called The Nutmeg's Curse by Amitav Ghosh. And I highly recommend it for those who really want to, you know, understand the climate crisis, but really the injustices that have led to the climate crisis. Because I feel that those of us who work in this space, and because we've been doing it for quite some time, we actually forget to connect with a lot of activists in other spaces and even just the general public about what climate injustices are. So for a lot of people, it just comes across as a technological or a scientific problem that requires a technological and scientific solution. But what we've actually really heard is that these injustices are actually grounded in the legacies of colonialism, slavery, genocide, which is manifested in patriarchy, systems of oppression that operate through capitalism, militarism, fundamentalism. And so colonialism, for many people, particularly the indigenous folks, people of color, gender non-binary and diverse populations around the globe, has never stopped. It's new forms, so neo-colonialism and neo-imperialism. And what we're now seeing is green capitalism or carbon colonialism. And all that means is that instead of conquerors coming in ships to invade and take over and exploit natural resources and labor, now they're doing it wearing suits in boardrooms in legitimate corporations. But the system itself, so the systems that we live, or rather, you know, all of us are more like trapped under, it still is a colonial, patriarchal, racist system that deliberately puts those of us in the global South in positions of inequality, discrimination, and violence. And so the solutions that are actually being peddled or sold or marketed by these same oppressive systems. And Neth made a really good point, right? About, so who owns these corporations? Who owns the most wealth? And yes, they are white men. They're 23 or 26 of the world's richest billionaires are white men. And this is really important because we have to understand how wealth is being generated and who it benefits. So we know now from these presentations that it is corporations and the men behind those corporations that are not only making that wealth for themselves, but really ensuring that they keep multiplying that wealth. And that's why the solutions that they offer is unjust. All right. And I was going to read from my thing, but hold on. Give me 1 more minute. So this is something that I picked up, right? This whole conversation, a lot of it is about energy. And this is how energy works. I'm just going to read, give me a geek moment here. I won't be long, I promise. So it says, most contemporary humans are completely dependent on energy that comes from long buried carbon. So what is coal, oil, and natural gas except fossilized forms of botanical matter? As for the circulation of goods or our exports, in that too, fossil fuels vastly outweigh any category of human-made goods. So energy is the most important commodity in the world today. And by almost any metric, the energy industry is impossibly large. Yearly energy sales at over $10 trillion dwarf expenditures on any other single commodity, that is trade, transport, and this is driven through 2 million kilometers of pipelines, 500 million deadweight tons of shipping, 8 of the 10 largest global corporations are energy companies, and 1/3 of the global shipping fleet is occupied by shipping oil. So given these figures, it may not be surprising that world energy consumption takes the equivalent of 2,800 barrels of oil per second to quench. And this is huge, right? When I read this, I was like mind blown. I was like, whoa, this is what energy looks like. This is what the production consumption of energy looks like. Every one of us is completely reliant on energy for our basic needs. So developing countries are really, like putting their feet down and saying, a lot of our people still need access to energy in order to really access basic standards of services and livelihoods, right? And yet we know energy is also the problem. And so this whole climate injustice, this whole debate around how do we transition? What are just solutions? What do renewables look like? It really comes down to energy. And we'll talk more about this, but I'll let the others now talk.
I would really like to come in, especially on the point that you raised, Kavita, on colonialism and how really it manifests and contributed to the crisis that we are in now. I bet if you go now to our favorite friend, Mr. Google, and you ask, for example, who discovered Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, or who discovered this river or that ocean, it will be the white man's name. It will never be the communities that we serve, and you can test that. And that is not by accident. It's really to alienate us from our natural surroundings, to alienate us from our nature, and to make it's theirs and it is not ours. And unfortunately, it was that knowledge and the hegemony that the capitalist system has created. Until recently, where I come from, I was told that Mount Kilimanjaro has been discovered by white men, right? And that is in the curriculum. And they systematically, the capitalist system within the patriarchy, systematically made us let go of all our traditional knowledge of who we are and our relationship with nature. And they impose the artificial relationship with nature. So today, as we are engaging, our ideals, for example, for development is not the ideal for development of the ideal for success is not us living in harmony with nature, is us living in a story, concrete jungle of blocks. That is what it has been sold as the solution, is us utilizing unsustainably energy, as you say. That is what is been sold as the solution. And those who are living in harmony, we continue to see them as poor, as uneducated, illiterate, those who doesn't know. And we even, unfortunately, even within our circle as feminists, we often use this language. We have to go to educate them. I think if anything, it's us that needs to be educated on how do we live in harmony, how do we protect our environment, and also how do we create sustainable solutions. So I think, to me, at the core of it is to challenge our own, to challenge the system, and to be cognizant also us as part and parcel of that problem, that we have been co-opted in the system. I've been educated in a very patriarchal system. So often than not, I have to check my education and my exposure, and to be cognizant that I might be part of the problem and not solution. Yes. So it is important, when we are speaking about this nature-based solution, where does it come from, for whom and what, and who benefit? One of the concern that I have is also commercialization of this solution. Those who have created the problem now are creating quote-unquote solution, and they're selling them for profit. So we can campaign, we can go to the halls of UNFCCC, and we can say we need this 100 and that 100. At the end of the day, all that money goes back to buy those solutions, and doesn't go to the community, to women who day in, day out have proven that they have solution. They continue to create the solution, because I can tell you for free, the community that I come from, our ancestors and our women, they are not waiting for white savior to come and save them and show how to live in harmony with nature. They are doing it, and it's just for us to recognize. And fundamentally, I think that is what part of the problem.
This is what a feminist looks like.
This is what the feminists look like.
Yes, it's very late in the night, but still, the energy is so high, because we are precisely debunking all of those false solutions that feed into this narrative of preserving the same system that has exploited, people, planet, our communities for the longest time. And you're right, Cav, it is not just a legacy, because when you say it's a legacy, it means it's already over and done with. It's continuing up to today, with unfair trade agreements, with illicit financial flows, with tax havens, etc., with militarization. So all the things that we have been talking about, are all encapsulated in our demand for system change. But how do we now unpack what system change means as our feminist solution? Because, here at CSW, we'll be talking about the need for greater women's participation, etc., mainstream. I so hate that bullshit, forgive me. But I think mainstreaming into a polluted stream is, it's bullshit, and we should challenge that. We should always be, rising up and speaking truth to power, that without, dismantling all the systems that oppress and exploit people and nature, then we'll never get out of this shit. Right, Gav? We had that interesting conversation.
Too many of those, my friend, too many of those. So, I mean, this is the thing, right? We have to recognize that the way the neoliberal agenda works is that it's very much entrenched, even in the processes that we're a part of, where we need to be to challenge it. So whether it's CSW, whether it's HLPF, whether it's UNFCCC and COP, we are constantly, again, very privileged, elite, white-dominated spaces, following processes and systems and structures and institutions that have been set up where our voices and our space is not only shrinking, but it's becoming rather tokenistic. And I recognize this, right? So what we need to figure out is, this is something that I'm sort of starting to learn, is what does affirmative sabotage look like? Which is, we are in the systems and we're trying to influence it, but we cannot, like in the COP spaces, It takes us 5 years to get one word into a document. And is that effective? And what more can we do? Valentina's got her hand up. Valentina, do you want to just jump in?
Yeah, thank you very much. We'll have a very interesting discussion. It's very important. Of course, what are our next actions? I agree totally with Tetet. We need to continue our advocacy work. Absolutely, advocate, and inform the population and all women's groups to involve more women in our activity. I would like to mention only some points. In Europe, in Central Asia region, thanks to UN Women, we organized a very interesting sub-regional consultation, which very active involvement of civil society. And I would like to mention some points. Now we have absolutely new design. The war in Ukraine has created a new context. Along of humanitarian crisis, the war affects the environment. And now we need to identify the impact and costs, because nobody told now about the ecological cost of this year and other military conflicts. We need to contribute to ensure connection of climate justice work to peace building, peacemaking, and women's involvement in the process. Another point, of course, it's important to promote gender responsive budgeting for gender transformative intervention, for risk disaster reduction and climate adaptation and mitigation measures. We can discuss more, but we should work at all levels to push government, to inform population, and to strengthen the capacity of our civil society. Our position paper is placed on the website. I put the link, and all of you who like to know more, please see these documents. Thank you very much. And only in common effort we can continue and can contribute to climate justice. Thank you.
That was really important, Valentina, because we really need to situate ourselves in the context of our realities. And right now, we have the climate crisis colliding with the pandemic, now colliding with the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. But not to forget that there have been conflicts happening in the global south for a number of years that has not got the attention as right now Europe has, which again shows how inequality is actually being used even through like mainstream media. People really do not talk about Yemen or Syria or Libya or Palestine. And all of this, Afghanistan, all of this, and Africa, parts of Africa as well, all of this has been ongoing. And we know that the inequalities, discrimination, and violence against women is at epidemic levels because of these colliding crises. And then we've got, and I love what Mishi said, about like those people who have created the problems, the systems that have created the problems are now coming up with the solutions. And we know this and we recognize this. So how do we move? How do we move to counter and challenge these narratives in the context of where we're operating? And I think there's a point that we should really bring up as activists also is, how do we as a feminist bloc remain resilient and strengthen our collaboration, solidarity, and care? Because it is getting more and more challenging. There's no doubt about it, right? Especially in the climate world. It's not a day that we wake up and we don't see some disaster unfolding. So how do we do that in the spaces? Particularly, this is really important. This is my first time being in CSW, so there's a lot that I need to learn and understand. But how can these parallel processes, which are generally very siloed, between HLPF, UNFCCC, the folks doing CBD desertification, UNEA, and what am I missing? CSW? Did I say that?
Yep.
How do we coalesce? How do we, because the systems we're fighting in any of these spaces are the same. Wait, who's got the hand up? Shamala?
Yeah, so many have been inspired to join the
All
conversation.
right, we've got more questions. All right, jump in. Shamala?
Thank you, Kavita. I'm Shamla from the Asian Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women. I must say that the sharing so far have been really rich, strong and insightful. And so from our end, we would like to share specifically on the nexus between climate change and SRHR, which is inextricably linked. So aligned with the discussion thus far, evidence, including studies by Arrow and other partners, specifically in Asia region, which is also at the forefront of climate crisis, reveal that the impacts of climate change are not gender neutral, and the pre-existing inequalities faced by women and girls in all their diversities are further amplified during climate disasters. Several factors, including their age, ethnicity, caste, class, marital, and socioeconomic status, ability, and educational level influence the extent to which women and girls are affected. And universal access to SRHR becomes even more challenging in the context of humanitarian crisis, as SRHR is already deprioritized in many countries and contexts, even before the onset of disasters. So when vital infrastructure are disintegrated due to a disaster, the access to SRHR become even more non-existent. So in such situation, the access to SRH services obstructed, leading to negative SRHR outcomes. This is also seen during the COVID pandemic when priorities shifted and the gender-specific needs of women and girls in all their diversities to adapt and also build their resilience to climate change disasters were deprioritized. So this is also relevant, especially in the ongoing conflict situation in Afghanistan and Ukraine, as Kavita was saying. So it is therefore, we feel it is really crucial to address the issues on the nexus between gender equality, SRHR, and climate change. The states should address the structural and systemic factors, including repealing and abolishing discriminatory practices and policies that violates SRHR and exacerbate gender inequality. And also, we strongly feel that national policies, programming, and budget related to climate change and disaster risk reduction must incorporate gender mainstreaming and SRHR and include gender differentiated impact analysis of climate change disasters and gender equality in line with the Paris Agreement and the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction. And of course, women in all their diversities must be recognized as agents of change and engaged meaningfully in the planning, financing, and implementation of climate responses, including in mitigation and adaptation initiatives at all levels and at all times. So that's all from us. From Arrow, thank you so much for this opportunity to share.
I see Faith.
Ted, Mishi, jump in. I've been talking too much.
No, I see Faith first, and then can wrap it up.
And Cecile also has her hand raised for some
We
time
might
now.
not have time for everybody though, so I suggest we go with one more question, if that's okay.
Sounds perfect.
Right. Hi, so can I go? Hello?
Yes, Faith.
Okay, so I think for me, what I wanted to share is not a question. I just wanted to share two solutions. So I think for me, in terms of dealing with neoliberalism and the ways in which capitalism has continued to influence the extent to which our governments can regulate the activity of corporations, but also the extent to which
communities can be able to hold corporations accountable is for us to begin to demand review of bilateral trade and investment treaties. Because when you look at, for instance, bilateral investment treaties, one of the challenges we have is that they are designed to protect the rights and interests of foreign investors. And so then our governments are unable to regulate the activities of these corporations. Also, I put in the link something around the Energy Charter Treaty, which is also a framework which is being used by energy corporations to be able to challenge government action when it comes to, for instance, climate justice. And I think this is one of those areas that a lot of us feminists within the climate justice movement are not really confronting, and yet they are intrinsically connected to the extent to which we can be able to influence and to influence some of these changes. And then also in terms of financing, I think for me, one of the other things that we need to begin to talk about is the mechanisms and the ways in which the financing that has been made available is in form of loans. And yet we know that when we talk about, for instance, loss and damage and the permanent damages that have come out of the climate crisis, we can no longer rely on loan financing. So we need to talk about compensations and financing that's basically flexible to be accessible to communities. Yeah, so those are some of the things I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Faith. I reckon we should give the floor to Cecile because there's been a few comments about we missing Cecile. So Cecile, if you could please keep it short, we'd be very grateful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I agree with all what the colleagues have said, but what I wanted to add is that we have a huge responsibilities of building capacities to local women, rural women, and indigenous. Those are the roots. If the roots are frail, then we are lost. If the roots are strong, then we have the good basis of all our advocacy work at national, regional, and global level. So please, let's see how we can build resilience of our rural women, our rural communities in this fight, which is highly competitive and highly political, and is coming from the historical, how do you call it, esclavage and all this. So please, let's put our thinking together, our resources to build the capacity of those people from where all the strength will come and influence the global world. Thank you.
So I think quickly to answer your question, Kavita, on what do we need to do from here? And first, I think I need to acknowledge the contribution of everyone. But I think I really draw hope and strength from the work that feminists are doing now. I think our movement is becoming stronger, is becoming diverse. I think we're taking recognition and we're making deliberate effort to have everyone into open space. At times when even, it's not as comfortable, but we have that commitment that we need to have a stronger and inclusive movement. So that I think is a step in the right direction. But also most of the feminists has taken on now the hard work of documenting solution. So the work that has been done on gender justice solutions is an evidence, because it's one thing to say women are doing things, but we cannot put that in writing, you cannot record, and you cannot show, and you cannot put that evidence. So I think that is amazing work, which all of us should be proud. But also the work of financing feminist and grassroots community. So the the Just Solutions grants that has been started as part of the Generation Equality Commitment is a step in the right direction. And more importantly, I think the work that all of us took to theorize, to imagine, and to dream for the better future. We are not waiting for somebody in a fancy university to do that work for us, but feminists have come together to start reimagining a different world. And I think, to me, that is an important step in the right direction. So I'm hopeful that the future is going to be better if feminists continue to take this work forward and continue to work together and build this amazing community of all of us. Thank you so much.
So then I reckon we give the floor to Andrea now, since we're very short on time, yeah?
Thank you so much, Kavita, Tetet, Mishi. Thank you so much for closing us off, especially with such strong words on how we're building more just worlds and more just futures within our movements. And I also want to thank all of our speakers who shared their knowledge on these false solutions. I have learned so much from you. So I just wanted to say that I'm so grateful for your time. And finally, I want to leave us with a final call to action and a short activity. If you'll just join us for a few minutes, I know we'll be a bit past our time. The final call to action is mostly centered on this need that we're talking about to build solidarity and power both across and within our movements for gender, climate, environmental, social, and economic justice, because that is really the crucial part of everything. That is where our hope lies in building this future together. Because together we must say no more sacrifice zones, no more land grabs, no more monoculture plantations and greenwashing, no more experiments on Indigenous and Global South lands and bodies. We need to denounce these false and dangerous solutions and put forth our feminist alternatives, like we've been saying, in the loudest and the boldest ways possible. Together we'll build this anti-capitalist, decolonial, and feminist world that we know is possible. And as we've been saying, it already exists in so many ways. This includes, like we said, asking for reparations and feminist finance for loss and damage, direct finance for gender just, grassroots, local climate solutions, divesting from militaries, war, and prisons, and instead investing in social protection and SRHR. And our call to action is that ultimately, without meaningful and real political engagement, without advocacy, as Valentina was saying, transformation is not possible. So our final call to action is asking you all to take away something from this session, a commitment as the people and as the folks who are here caring about these issues. We're asking you to join social movements, to join our movements, to do advocacy in different forms. So I want to share a Mentimeter with you in the chat. It's the same link that we used before. And I want to just ask you to write down what advocacy action or commitment you're taking away from our session today. This can be joining a local feminist collective in your city or neighborhood. This can be, if you're at CSW, for example, pushing for no false solutions in the agreed conclusions, learning about and joining struggles against mega projects in your region, for example, and building solidarity within your own movement. And it can also even be just redistributing your wealth and resources. So I invite you to join us in adding your commitment to the Mentimeter. You can also add your commitment to the chat if that's easier for you. And I'll read some of them out. So continue to call out false solutions and challenge rhetoric wherever I have the opportunity to speak. Using my positionality as a white person in the global north to hold those in power to account. Yeah, it's especially important for those of us in the global north to be calling on the governments where we reside, because ultimately they are the ones who hold that power and we need to challenge them to redistribute that power. Someone said confronting neoliberalism, especially that which has been embedded in economic policies. So yeah, without
taking up too much of your time, I would ask people to continue putting their commitments in the chats and in the Mentimeter. I also wanted to open up space before we head out to ask people to share any upcoming advocacy opportunities and resources. Shout out to Faith and Coraina, who already shared resources on debunking nature-based solutions. And Liana and Nikki already shared some resources on geoengineering. We'll also share those all with the people who registered for the event via email. But yeah, just wanted to open the space. I think also my colleague Katie wanted to share an event and a new projects that we have going on. I think you put it in the chat, but if you want to say it out loud as well, Katie, you're more than welcome to.
Thanks so much, Andrea. I'll be really quick. We have a new co-convened space on feminist economic and climate justice, which is looking at exactly the kind of things we've been talking about today and really challenging those interlinkages of neoliberalism, capitalist extraction, patriarchy, all of that. And we really want it to be complementary to and grounded in the work that you're all doing. So our global kickoff will be Tuesday, April 12th over Zoom. And there's a bit.ly in the chat, and I'll put it back in another time so you can sign up if you want to join us or have other ideas about how we can use this initiative to advance this specific agenda. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Katie. Yeah, it'll be a great space to build across climate justice and economic justice movements. And I also think, Pat, you wanted to share something on the Women and Gender Constituencies resource on false solutions, which was released ahead of COP. But thank you, I see that you put it in the chat. Does anyone else have any advocacy opportunities that they would like to share that are coming up? Okay, and if not, I see people are populating the chat a lot. And thank you so much for joining us. I know we are over time. Thank you for writing down your commitments. And we also wanted to invite you, if you would want to join our feminist constituencies. This event was co-organized by the Women's Major Group, the Women and Gender Constituency, and Campaign of Campaigns, all of which you can get involved with, of course. And we wanted to extend that invitation to you. I don't know, Shanaz, if you want to pull up the slide where it says how you can join and the links. But just wanted to leave you with that invitation to join us, to join our movements. Though, of course, there's so many other ways to engage as we've been sharing and to join movements for social justice, climate justice, environmental justice. And thank you so much for being with us here today. It has been such a wonderful